Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Environ team, I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar, and thank you for taking time out of your day to learn more about California's Climate Accountability Package. After introductions from our speakers today, we'll take a look at some key macro trends shaping climate disclosure. We'll then hear from our partner, Big Pivot, with some ideas for visually preparing climate disclosures. After that, I'll dive into the compliance requirements for the two rules, and then my colleague Steve will speak to how we can support you if you need assistance preparing for compliance by early next year. We'll round out the session with a look at legal and assurance services to proactively avoid penalties and liability. We should also have a few minutes left at the end to answer your questions, and you can use the Q&A function to submit any questions that come up during the presentation. Within the coming days, we'll share a recording of this webinar along with the slide deck, any answers to questions that we can't get to today, as well as the climate disclosure blueprint to help guide the preparation of your disclosures. With that, I'll start off our team on introductions. My name is Constance Duke, and I'm a senior sustainability consultant on Environ's data and reporting team. I've worked in sustainability for nearly 2 decades, in-house, in climate tech, and now in consulting, of course. And my recent focus has been on really the more technical side of things, double materiality assessments, climate risk analysis, and scenario planning, and all the behind-the-scenes work that makes climate and other sustainability disclosures meaningful. My goal for today is to help you make sense of the new California rules and make compliance feel achievable. And with that, I'll pass it on to Joel.
Thank you. My name is Joel Sharon. I'm a partner with Big Pivot Partners, a leading full-service stakeholder communications design firm and solutions provider. I too bring an extensive history in sustainability with over 30 years of experience helping clients with not only sustainability, but also investor strategic marketing goals through cost-effective, impactful solutions. I'm here to support Environ and help our audience present the materials not only from a compliance standpoint, but also to help tie it back to brand and also their messaging. So thank you for your time today, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Joel, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Steve Schramm. I joined Environ about last year, and I fill the role of Senior Sales Executive. Happy you're with us today. I've spent the last 14 years in hospital operations, particularly in supply chain and sustainability. Looking forward to today's webinar.
Hello, everyone. Brian Novak here, VP of Sustainability Services with Environ Energy. Until recently led our verification and assurance practice as well. So looking forward to diving into that a bit more. I've been in the sustainability space for nearly a decade, leading into that also in finance and accounting, as well as the supply chain management. So looking forward to the conversation today. And as Constance mentioned, please add any questions you have along the way.
Thank you all for the introductions. And while we're on introductions, let me also briefly introduce our company, Environ Energy, in case some of you aren't familiar with the breadth of services that we offer. I'll start with our sustainability and ESG-related services because that's most pertinent to today's topic. And this division delivers strategic global sustainability services from really just getting started with sustainability data all the way to preparing comprehensive, mandatory, and voluntary sustainability disclosures. We also offer public and private training, often in partnership with leading standards organizations. And as Brian mentioned, we have an independent assurance arm to validate sustainability data and other information. To further support decarbonization, we have a team focused on integrated renewable energy solutions that can help develop cost-effective strategies to meet interim and net zero emissions reduction targets. And this pairs really well with our engineering solutions team that focuses on building decarbonization by offering everything from initial energy audits and project finance to turnkey energy efficiency projects and ensuring alignment with the latest building performance standards. And lastly, we have a highly skilled energy procurement team that supports organizations with optimizing energy purchasing, minimizing risk, supply contract negotiations, utility bill management, and much more. And with that, let's jump into the core of today's topic. So when we talk about the California Climate Accountability Package, I think it's important to understand where these laws are coming from and that they are not isolated initiatives. So let's take a look at the macro trends that are shaping climate disclosure and driving climate transparency in today's environment. We'll focus on 4 key trends to watch. The first, of course, is physical climate risk, the floods, the wildfires, the droughts, and so on, that are having a measurable financial impact. In terms of disclosure implications, it means that discussion of risk at the asset level is critical, including disclosure of your methodology, and most importantly, the impact on the resilience of your organization across various time horizons. Then we have regulatory convergence. Laws like those in California are being considered by other states as well, including Washington, New York, and Illinois. And of course, globally, with the widespread adoption of the ISSB standards, that's the International Sustainability Standards Board. The second of the 2 standards they've published, IFRS S2, of course, being exclusively focused on climate disclosures. Investor and market pressure are also key drivers of climate disclosures, including demand for the level of rigor that makes these disclosures decision useful for shareholders and also for other stakeholders. And as a result of this, we're starting to see climate disclosures having a real impact on the cost of capital. And then we have systems transformation stemming from large-scale changes in supply chains, increasingly considering the intersection of nature risk and climate risk and what they mean for people and for organizational resilience. And of course, we have climate tech adoption. So all of these are reshaping how we view risks and opportunities, including over much longer time frames than we used to in the traditional enterprise planning. So globally, the number of climate-related disasters has increased 5-fold from the 1970s to the 2010s, according to the World Meteorological Organization. In the US, billion-dollar disasters have quadrupled over the same time frame, and then they doubled again when we look at the average number of disasters so far this decade compared to the 2010s. In 2023, US billion-dollar disaster events cost nearly $93 billion. And I just want to make you aware that this is one of the tracking programs that the current administration has eliminated. So 2024 is the last year on record for now where you'll be able to see this data from NOAA. Let's look at how that physical risk manifests. So one trend we're seeing now is property insurance providers exiting markets globally. And usually that's in areas that are already hardest hit, like California due to wildfires, Florida due to flooding, and that's in the US. And by 2030, we expect that more than 500,000 properties in Australia will no longer be insurable. Some countries like the UK and Switzerland are now working on public-private pooled risk solutions where some of the private insurer risk is offset through government subsidies. The other area raising a lot of concern is global infrastructure, which just wasn't built to withstand current conditions and didn't account for higher sea levels or the number of flood events we're experiencing now. So current annual global infrastructure losses already exceed $300 billion and around $800 billion when we include social assets like schools and hospitals, for example. Under a 2 degrees Celsius warming pathway, we're looking at over $4 trillion worth of infrastructure risk worldwide. And this alone will obviously impact companies who rely on that public infrastructure, but additionally, major global companies are expected to face costs upward of $1 trillion per year related just to physical climate risks. Here is a quick snapshot of the state of climate disclosure rules globally. So the purple dots are finalized ISSB mandates. The light blue ones are pending, and the dark blue ones are finalized climate disclosure rules that are not related to the ISSB standards. All of these are specific climate disclosure rules only. There are obviously many additional standards and frameworks that include climate-related disclosures just in the broader context of sustainability, like the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This map also doesn't show environmental reporting requirements for large emitters of greenhouse gases or reporting related to emissions trading schemes. So if we were to add this in, there would be even more dots on this map. I mentioned earlier that climate disclosure is impacting cost of capital as investors are pushing for transparency. So here are some of the studies that support this claim. MSCI found over a period of 9 years that higher ESG ratings correspond to lower financing costs for both equity and debt financing. There was also an interesting S&P 500 study which showed that higher climate disclosure scores correlate with lower cost of capital. And this is true even where actual emissions reduction performance is poor. So that indicates that disclosure alone drives that lower cost of capital and not necessarily performance against targets. There are also numerous other studies across different countries that consistently show a link between disclosure and lower cost of capital. I imagine that most of you are familiar with the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, but this speaks to some of the systemic shifts I mentioned earlier. I've linked this in the deck, but the key takeaway here is that large-scale systemic shifts are truly dominating the risk landscape, especially when we look at medium time horizons, so about 10 years out. I'll let you digest some of this information while we hear from Joel, and then we'll get into the details of the California Senate bills. Over to you, Joel.
Thank you. I appreciate the lead in. And as I walk through this, keep in mind there's a few things to consider as you begin to go down the path of this another reporting requirement. As we explore this journey through this new reporting under California SB 261 and 253, Big Pivot really prides ourselves in being strategic, experienced, and creative in helping organizations not only meet the regulatory requirement, but also providing some context around your storytelling and tied back into your brand. So it really shouldn't be a check the box exercise. It really should be an opportunity to demonstrate your leadership, your vision, and really a commitment to a sustainable future. And Big Pivot has more than 30 years of experience of supporting companies across sustainability, investor communications, but also our stakeholder communications. So if you want to go to the, let's see, first technology is fun, right? Actually, go back one slide real quick. Just to add on to my initial introduction, Big Pivot is really an award-winning solution provider. We partner with subject matter experts like Environ, as well as other investor relations organizations, corporate communications firms, to really to help tell your story, but also be in compliance with the different frameworks that you're going to experience, including obviously the new California laws. We've got a proven track record providing cost-effective solutions with detailed project management, supporting companies of all sizes, ranging from startups to the Fortune 500. And as you can see on this slide, corporate reports, interactive branding, and also sustainability solutions to meet all your needs. So, all right, you can go to the next one. I think one of the important steps, right, is to really establish a reporting process that brings best practices into play, but also working with organizations that are flexible enough to have best practice processes that integrate into your internal processes. The process that you see on the screen really is the beginning of the designing a report to meet not only the regulatory requirements, but really to help tell your story. And all of that is done in the beginning, right, with an alignment through a kickoff and a strategy meeting, to make sure that not only are we meeting requirements, but also meeting your internal brand standards, making sure we accommodate all your different stakeholders that you're communicating to. And then through the design process, the report will evolve into a communication tool first, and the creative to support that, to make sure, again, it meets compliance and regulatory requirements, but also helps tell or support your story, whether that's through your sustainability report. So there's a consistent message across all pieces that you're delivering to your audiences. Again, to make sure that you continue to comply and tell your story consistently throughout all the different pieces. And then as we move from the design aspect, we get into the content, right? So you'll work with an environment to help develop the strategy, determine KPI metrics that align with the California requirements, to make sure that, again, it's first a compliant with regulatory alignment, with the ultimate output being a PDF or whatever the final medium is going to be to submit to the regulatory agencies. So, as you establish these reporting processes, I think it's going to be critical to have a single point of contact to help drive the report and to meet the deadlines as we approach August. You can go to the next one. So, given the limited amount of time today, and happy to kind of circle back if you have more questions around from a storytelling standpoint and beyond the numbers. I think the key thing to keep in mind, this is really communication 101, right? And I don't think this is anything different than what you've done in your other reports. So this probably serves more as a reminder that, again, this is an opportunity to really tell your story and beyond just being a compliance document, right? So clarity and simplicity, using infographics, clear tables, digestible graphics, really scannable information. So as a reader, as a user experience, you can get the gist of the information, but also obviously being in compliance, which leads me into the the transparency component, highlighting your methodologies, your verification sources, KPIs, and other clear data sources. As you begin to present this information, consider viewing orientation from a readership standpoint, whether it's going to be mobile friendly, color palettes, fonts, type sizes for ease of reading, but also accessibility, right? Consistency, again, as you have crafted your message across TCFD reports, your sustainability ESG reports, and other reporting that you've done throughout the year. Obviously, you tie into the California requirements, but it should tie back into your consistent message to continue to building that trust, ensuring compliance, and driving a meaningful impact. I've touched on the regulatory alignment. Obviously, it just needs to be clearly denoted, right? Reporting years, phase rollouts, key actions. These are the things that will be developed through your content development and clearly communicated in the kickoff meeting that will lead into creative approaches. Again, the big buzzword is storytelling. There's still an opportunity to talk about your messaging to your key stakeholders and what you're doing along your sustainability journey. And this is just another compliance document that can allow you to really elaborate on that and reemphasize that messaging. So it's really, impactful compliance beyond the numbers to help you tell your compelling story to investors and stakeholder communications. So go to the next. I know I'm running through this. So I used this as an example to show how, from a branding standpoint, that it's just as important to tie back your brand as you try, as you work from a requirement standpoint. The requirements of SB 261, 253 cover climate-related risk, mitigation strategies, climate scenarios, emission metrics, targets, and risk timelines. Again, our approach is more than just compliance. It's about leveraging your brand's voice, your visual identity to present information in an engaging way through creative use of colors, topography, charts and graphs. Make sure your stakeholders understand and connect your message. So, these are just some, initial simple examples of how you can present different information. And really through the design process, we show different styles, or you can see different styles, how to present the information that not only is clear and concise, but also meets the regulatory requirements and also your brand standards. So I think I'm coming up probably on my time limit. Again, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to providing, some examples and blueprints of information on how you can present this information and be a standout while you meet your requirements. So I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Joel, for these great ideas and tips. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I want to decode the requirements of SB 253 and SB 261, explain where you have some flexibility for the first year and where you don't, point out key risks for meeting requirements by the deadline, and then also share some tips to approach this compliance effort strategically, but also efficiently. So here we have a side-by-side view of the two laws, SB 253, which has been codified in Section 38532 of California's Health and Safety Code, and then SB 261 to be found in Section 38533. Just for familiarity, I'll continue to refer to them as SB 253 and 261 today, but just wanted to let you know where their new formal home is. SB 253 is an emissions disclosure only rule for companies exceeding $1 billion in annual global revenues. For now, you'll have to calculate and report emissions from your direct operations and purchased energy, known as Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then starting in 2027, you'll additionally need to report emissions that occur upstream and downstream of your direct operations. And those are known as Scope 3 emissions. The California Air Resources Board, CARB, will develop an online portal for the annual submission of your emissions inventory with the first report due in January 2026, and it does require external assurance. This rule has a very steep penalty for noncompliance, up to $500,000 per year. SB 261 mirrors the disclosure format of the TCFD framework, that's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has been absorbed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, but is still referenced as the TCFD framework. Its focus is on the strategic approach to climate risk, including governance and oversight, the identification of risks and opportunities, climate-related metrics and targets, and the approach to risk mitigation and adaptation, again, to ensure long-term organizational resilience. And to be clear, this framework is about material financial risks from climate change to your organization. You do not have to cover non-material financial risks or how your company manages climate-related impacts to people or the environment. This rule applies to companies exceeding $500,000 in annual revenue, and reports only need to be published every other year. CARB will open a public docket in December of this year where you can post the link to your report by January 2026. So you'll probably want to just house this on your website and then drop the link into this central database. Assurance of your published information is not required for SB 261, and penalties for noncompliance can amount to $50,000 a year. Per CARB's 2024 enforcement notice, penalties are waived for both rules for year one only, provided that you make timely submissions and that those submissions represent a good faith effort to report. And we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. But I want to make sure that everyone understands that the waiver of penalties does not cover non-disclosure. There's been a lot of chatter around what it means to do business in California, and here is what we know. The rules do not only impact companies headquartered in California. If you have sales in California exceeding around $735,000 per year, If you have qualifying real assets in the state, if you meet certain payroll thresholds in California or are subject to franchise tax obligations, it means you're doing business in California. Now, CARB is still working on some exact definitions specifically for these new rules, but we expect this to be really similar to the existing franchise tax board definition, which I've included here on the right. And I'll just say be sure to double check those thresholds. They may still change for 2025, but this is the latest available. So knowing the effort that goes into preparing emissions inventories and TCFD-aligned climate disclosures, January is incredibly close unless you already routinely prepare these disclosures. So I'd say if you have not yet started at all, getting it done by the end of the year will certainly be challenging. The first submissions happen by January 1, 2026, and for your emissions data, you have the option to use either calendar or fiscal year 2025. For your climate strategy disclosures, you get slightly more flexibility because you can additionally select your 2023 fiscal year ending in 2024. And this, of course, helps if you haven't compiled all the information needed to prepare this report for the fiscal year ending in 2025. Then by January 27, you'll have to submit a complete Scope 3 emissions inventory in addition to Scope 1 and 2, but the SB 261 report will not be due that year. So you have between now and the end of next year to tackle your Scope 3 emissions. I mentioned earlier that you'll need to have your Scope 1 and 2 emissions assured starting in year 1, but there is a safe harbor period for Scope 3 emissions from 2027 through 2029 where you do not have to seek assurance. However, in 2030, assurance kicks in for Scope 3 and it levels up in rigor for Scopes 1 and 2, and Brian will talk to us a bit later about limited and reasonable assurance. So how complex is it to comply with these rules? And I would say that depends entirely on how much work you've already done in this space. Many companies have already prepared complete Scope 1, 2, and 3 inventories, and they're using leading emissions accounting frameworks like the GHG protocol. Many companies also have software in place to track emissions company-wide. If you are among those companies, your work on SB 253 is basically done. You'll probably have to prorate some of your Q4 emissions since the deadline is right on January 1st. But there is nothing that I would consider to be burdensome about this regulation for you at this stage. Companies that have not prepared an emissions inventory should understand that this is a pretty substantial lift, and especially depending on the complexity of your organization. And your emissions have to be calculated company-wide for all entities in scope, not just for California. And this is especially time-intensive for companies with many different energy sources or fugitive emission sources. And then being part of a partnership or a joint venture can add even more complexity. If you think about purchasing, implementing, and launching data collection in a software tool, now it will be a really tight time frame and it might not come to fruition, especially when we think about the need for quality control, and then also making time for that external assurance process. So just weigh carefully whether it makes sense to buy software for the first year submission, whether to do it in-house manually or work with consultants. There are, of course, benefits and drawbacks to all of these options, and I'll highlight just a few of those shortly. For SB 261, if you regularly publish climate reports aligned with TCFD or with IFRS S2, you are again in good shape, though you will want to make sure that the report speaks specifically to California stakeholders by calling out California's risk profile and actions, and how you capitalize on opportunities in California as well. Or if you have no physical assets in California, then just state that there's no material financial risk and focus instead of transition-related risks like market, technology, legal, and reputation risks and opportunities only. If you've not previously prepared this type of report, it will feel quite complex because it covers so many areas of climate-related oversight, management, and metrics that you now have to go and dig up in your organization. One thing you will definitely want to prioritize is a climate risk assessment, or else you really won't have much to talk about in your report. If you launch a climate risk assessment now, you'll probably be edging up towards the end of Q3 by the time that's done. So again, time is of the essence. We do get quite a few questions about climate scenario analysis and whether that is required. Climate scenario analysis is a tool for stress testing organizational resilience under various plausible climate futures, and it is explicitly called out in the strategy pillar of the TCFD framework. So even though SB 261 doesn't say you have to do climate scenario analysis, it is implied by reference to TCFD. That said, climate scenario can be really challenging to do in less than 4 to 6 months. So if you haven't started, I would say the two best options are to either limit scenarios for the initial report or include a justifiable reason for excluding it in year one. You can see a commonly used format for this type of analysis here on the right. And if you have to cut it down, I would recommend starting with the 2 quadrants on the left, orderly and disorderly transition, and save the right-hand more extreme quadrants for later. A lot of companies that do not have systems in place now will probably want to start preparing the data and disclosures manually. And this is possible in some organizations and to some extent. So for instance, a fairly straightforward emissions inventory for, let's say, a set of administrative offices can be done in a spreadsheet. But it is hard to scale this approach, and errors are definitely more common without those automated quality checks. And that, again, is really important when you need to get your data validated by a third party. Where you'll probably run into the biggest issue is for physical climate risk assessments, because this requires layers of risk data against which you can map your facility's geolocations. And this is typically done with software, which also contains climate models and pathways for assigning risk scores or risk ratings to your individual properties. There are some free tools on the market that support high-level risk screening, but that's generally insufficient because it doesn't provide enough information to really home in on high-risk assets. So here you'll want to either procure software, or you can work with consultants like us who offer these assessments as a tech-enabled service. Now, here are some things you want to avoid. The first one, obviously misjudging whether you do business in California and just not submitting, because that can result in those really steep fines. So be conservative, and in case of doubt, you can always consult your legal counsel. I mentioned that CARB is still working out some definitions and developing the submission portal. Don't wait for them to hammer out all those little details, because they will not change anything about the work that you have ahead of you. Know that you will have to submit Scope 3 emissions. Based on the wording in the rule, I've heard some companies speculate that they could get away with not reporting Scope 3 at all. And that specific wording is something like report Scope 3 emissions if they are technologically feasible and data is reasonably available. And I can tell you for 99.9% of companies, Scope 3 inventories are in fact technologically feasible and data is reasonably available. There are some, kind of really unique exceptions. So if you're a startup that already meets the reporting threshold, or if you make a product that's just so unique that no emission factors and no proxy factors exist anywhere, you'd probably be justified in omitting some Scope 3 categories, but even then, probably not all. So when the regulation talks about data being available, it doesn't mean you have to have perfect activity data for all of your upstream and downstream activities. Spend-based data is fine. Proxies in general are fine. As long as your methods align with the GHG protocol or an equivalent, you have quite a bit of flexibility while trying to improve your inventory with actual supplier data in the coming years. SB 261 is not a report you can quickly assemble and submit. It is a real analytical effort, and it does take time, but it also offers real strategic insights beyond meeting those compliance requirements. And then lastly, both SB 253 and SB 261 compliance efforts need to be adequately resourced. Part of the reason that the non-compliance penalties for these rules are so high is to easily compete with what it costs to even fund this effort. And keep in mind that once you have all your work streams and systems in place, it does become less resource intensive over time. So be sure to assign internal ownership early on and ideally find an executive sponsor or an ally to ensure that resourcing is proportionate to the required effort. I touched earlier on having some flexibility in year one, and this is true, but there are some caveats. In year one, you must make a good faith effort based on data and other information available now. You do have enough time to identify gaps and at least develop this high-level roadmap for closing them. And then this is something you can speak to in your first report. If you don't have processes and systems in place today, help your investors and other stakeholders understand how you intend to get there. If you overdo it with placeholders, it probably won't look much like a good faith effort. So try to pull as much as you can from your internal teams, from your internal subject matter experts. You'll want to get to the point of making this a cross-functional strategic effort that includes rigorous analysis of your risks and your mitigating actions along with opportunities. CARP hasn't actually defined good faith effort, but we can make an educated guess that it includes submitting on time, using recognized accounting protocols. I've mentioned the GHG protocol a couple of times, making clear disclosures about data limitations or estimates, and showing a roadmap to improve over time. I'll also mention here that there are no penalties for honest errors. But beyond year one, you should expect penalties not just for failure to submit, but also for material misstatements or negligent reporting. I wanted to share some pro tips as we round out the section, tying back to what we've discussed so far. So make sure you have a strong core working group internally that can productively contribute to meeting the requirements. This would obviously include anyone working on sustainability or climate strategy and data in your company, but also departments like risk management, compliance, finance and accounting, operations, product, sourcing, and even IT if you're considering purchasing software. For most wholly owned companies, identifying who's doing business in California is pretty straightforward. But for complex entities, including those with independent subsidiaries or partners, or companies that have recently been involved in mergers or acquisitions, an early due diligence effort can prevent non-compliance. So find out which companies or which entities you need to tag as doing business in California. While you can recycle most of the content from existing TCFD or IFRS S2 disclosures to comply with SB 261, keep in mind that the intended audience for this report are California investors and other stakeholders. One of the programmatic goals of the rules is to ensure that accurate, comparable, and decision-useful climate information is made available to investors, consumers, and other interested parties. So California-izing your report just means making it relevant to that audience. This does not apply to SB 253 because emissions generated anywhere will ultimately impact everyone, so that state delineation isn't necessary here. With more rigorous assurance requirements coming up in 2030, use the safe harbor years from 2027 to 2029 to get ready for this. It's another one of those things you definitely don't want to delay until the last minute because it does substantially impact what and how much you need to document. And this brings me to the next tip, which is to be really diligent about documenting your processes, sources, assumptions, exclusions, and so on from the very beginning. Work with team members who are experienced with applying GHG emissions accounting protocols and who know how to prepare a thorough GHG inventory management plan, because that will give you a consistent and defensible approach that you can carry forward. And also start thinking about how you plan to account for your applicable Scope 3 categories by evaluating where you have activity data, probably business travel, waste, maybe upstream transportation, where you'll have to use samples or proxy data, maybe employee commuting, downstream transportation, and where you'll initially have to rely on spend-based data like purchased goods and services and capital goods. And if you're in the financial sector, as much as 99% of your emissions might fall into a single Scope 3 category, so obviously focus on that. If you do use the spend-based approach for any of your indirect emissions categories, keep in mind that this really only makes sense for screening purposes the first time around, but beyond that, start working with your suppliers to obtain more accurate data in the coming years. For our final takeaways, the most important one, which I have probably mentioned ad nauseum today, is to start now. The amount of effort involved in this type of work is notoriously underestimated and under-resourced, so you'll want to get ahead of that. California sent their enforcement notice back in December 2024, so they were pretty realistic about the amount of time it takes to get ready for compliance with these rules. We're now at the end of July, so if you haven't started yet, you've lost more than half of that anticipated prep time already. Start thinking about how you can use the information you disclose for strategic purposes, as Joel has mentioned. There is so much value in the insights that you can gain from climate disclosures, and they'll eventually serve as the foundation of your climate transition plan. So treating this lightly has consequences beyond those potentially very steep penalties, including the cost of capital we talked about earlier today. And lastly, I want to emphasize again that these laws do require a rigorous, diligent approach, and the quality of your disclosures matters. There is no good way to get this right with a light touch, so make sure you allocate enough time for the remainder of the year, have an executive on your side, and work with people who are skilled in emissions accounting and climate reporting. And I will now turn it over to my colleague Steve to talk a bit about how we can support you in this work.
Thank you, Constance. And if you can go one more slide here. Okay. First things first, Constance and Joel, your reputation and expertise definitely precede you. So thank you for walking us through that. I did notice several questions being submitted to the Q&A section. We will address those here in a couple minutes. So I'll run through this rather briefly, but we just wanted to illustrate here some of the problems you may encounter while you go through this California compliance regulations. So if you are in the beginning of your journey and you don't know where to begin, we are here to help you. If you, depending on your size and your structure, if you're an organization that maybe does not have an internal governance structure today, like Environ is here to partner with you and to guide you through that journey. You may not need a full-scale solution. You may need something that's a little more modular or scalable to your organization. Again, we are able to help you. So really, like you will work with several folks on this team, including Constance, Joel, and myself and Brian, just to walk you through how we can support you on this work. Constance, if you can go to the next slide. So we put together two packages here for you, a standard compliance package that will meet all of the needs for Senate Bill 253 and 261, as well as a more full scale. If you're on the more complex end of the organization, you're looking to do a full scale strategy package. We put together everything in the first package, as well as a full scope 3 inventory, site level physical risk analysis, climate scenario analysis, and decarbonization levers. On the bottom, you'll see here a couple of things that are more a la carte. So science-based target initiatives, climate transition planning, greenhouse gas assurance, which Brian will talk about here in a moment. Those are all things we can also include in a package. And lastly, here is just a couple incentives. So we have clients on this webinar today that currently use us for our services. So there are a couple incentives there for a retainer and a loyalty. And if you are ready to move forward with some of this work, there's also an early adopter incentive as well. And Constance, I think we're good.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. We'll now move on to Brian to talk a little bit about legal and assurance services.
Thank you, Constance. Legal and assurance services, fun. So I'll share a little bit of information here, a way to look at both legal and assurance services as a means to both meet the requirements of these Senate bills as we're referring to them, and to reduce risk. For those that may not have undergone assurance before, just wanted to give a little bit of a primer here and context on what assurance is. So, just purely from a definition standpoint, assurance is a systematic, independent, and documented process to confirm the accuracy and conformance of reported non-financial data against a predefined reporting criteria or framework. That criteria or framework could be certain examples are the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, GRES, CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, or against GRI standards from the Global Reporting Initiative. In our case, we will be looking at the final rulemaking that'll be determined by CARB, likely in alignment with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as we go through the assurance process. The purpose of assurance here increases the likelihood that the reported results are correct. I think that's really the primary reason here, as this is a regulatory report. Want to ensure the users of the information can rely on that data. And then, of course, it adds credibility to those reported results. When thinking about assurance, there are a variety of assurance standards, which are rules to be followed when conducting an engagement. Some of the most common standards you may see are the ISO 1464-3, the Accountability 1000 Assurance Standard, bolded here. That is the one that we have traditionally applied at Environ, or the SA 8000. There are others out there as well. We have yet to see one clearly designated as the assurance standard for the assurance requirement. I will mention this ISA 5000, which is an emerging standard. It has been formalized but not effective until the end of 2026. Uh, just want to mention that as we do expect some consolidation of reporting and assurance standards around that particular one is introduced by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board with a complementary assurance standard from the financial perspective as well. So just from their authoritative space, expect that to be a leader soon to come. If we can jump to the next slide. So I just wanted to mention there are some terms that are currently synonymous from the sustainability perspective, I would say, with assurance, sometimes called verification, attestation, or validation. There are some slightly different meanings. Verification traditionally focuses on checking if something meets specified requirements. Assurance typically provides a higher level of confidence in the reliability and accuracy of information. However, even from the latest guidance from CARB, the FAQs that were sent out just 2 weeks ago, they do interchange the terms verification and assurance. Another aspect of assurance is the assurance level. There are two primary levels, reasonable and limited. They vary in terms of the depth of testing, reasonable being more rigorous. Also in the level of evidence that's required to be provided from the reporting organization, limited being less so. Also, there are opportunities to go through readiness assessments to review processes, systems, controls that organizations are currently undertaking as a way to determine the readiness to pursue limited and or reasonable assurance in the future. So something for organizations certainly to consider if they have yet to undergo an assurance engagement. Just looking at the next slide here, there typically are 5 aspects to an assurance engagement. First, a 3-party relationship. You have the responsible party or reporting company, the practitioner or the assurance provider, and then finally the intended user or audience, in this case, the regulator, but also stakeholders at large. Then you have the subject matter, which is the information that's being evaluated. It must be identifiable, measurable, and capable of being evaluated. In this case here, which will be phased in first, are those scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. The third aspect is a suitable criteria. So this is the standard benchmark or criteria to evaluate the subject matter. This is the greenhouse gas protocol or perhaps even the regulation itself. Um, uh, right now, signs are pointing to the greenhouse gas protocol, but we're monitoring any specific rulemaking that may come about before year end. The fourth aspect here is evidence, sufficient evidence at that needs to be reliable and support the conclusions being made. And from the assurance provider's perspective, this evidence is gathered through inquiry, observation, and testing of the inventory that's been developed. And then finally, you arrive at the conclusion or determination of the assurance provider upon the subject matter. So just to give a little background on what you may expect there. Uh, just to share on the assurance requirements, this has been touched upon already, but the first report to be reported in 2026 on 2025 data, there is a requirement for limited assurance on scope 1 and scope 2. This must be provided by an independent assurance provider. For scope 3, that is not phased in from an assurance perspective until 2030. And at that same time, scope 1 and scope 2 will be advanced to that reasonable level. So once again, just kind of simplified on the right side here in 2026, the first year of reporting, limited assurance on scope 1 and scope 2. And then in 2030, that will be increased to the reasonable level with limited assurance of scope 3 data. Now, I do just want to touch briefly on legal review and our legal review process. In many cases, sustainability disclosures traditionally have been voluntary, but claims are still public and subject to scrutiny. There have been claims of greenwashing becoming more prevalent. However, as regulatory requirements are growing from this California climate reporting requirement to proposed regulations in New York and other jurisdictions, as well as international frameworks, whether it's CSRD out of Europe or stock exchange related requirements. There are certain risks to these disclosures. You may be non-compliant with requirements. You may share inaccurate or misleading content. Um, may state unintended commitments publicly that could be tied to, as well as there may be inconsistencies with other corporate disclosures that are being made. We do recommend legal teams are involved, whether in-house counsel or outside counsel. However, traditionally, what we've seen in our experience is that attorneys are engaged at the final stages or not at all. We do have a blog, which I recommend you to take a look at on our website, how to engage attorneys early in your reporting and to reduce risk. So if you have a moment after this webinar, I do recommend you take a look there. And just to share, so we do offer kind of 3 different ways to have this legal review. First is a tier 1 just at the outset to educate the attorneys on your team to understand what to look for and the SMEs as well, things to be mindful of as we're going through to prepare these disclosures. Also confirm the approach that we'll be taking as we set out on this work to develop the report and the underlying data for disclosure, and then set a cadence for the in-house attorney to be involved throughout the process. An alternative is at the end for us to support you by taking a final review of the information, providing written brief and walking through those items, ensuring your questions are answered, and we feel confident in the final report to be disclosed. And then finally, just our support throughout the engagement. So this includes both tier 1 and tier 2, but we would be with you side by side, engaging, reviewing, and advising throughout the preparation of the information, just to ensure that we're not left at the last minute with maybe some significant hurdles that may or may not be able to be addressed. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Constance. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was so helpful. We have a few minutes left for Q&A, and I see some coming in through the Q&A channel. So I'm going to try to get to as many of those as possible. I think there might be one for you too, Brian. So if you want to stay on just a sec. The first question is, are both SB 253 and 261 due on January 1st? And the answer is yes, as of right now, they are both due at the beginning of next year. Another question, does SB 253 take a materiality lens for Scope 1 and Scope 2? So your Scope 1 and 2 emissions inventory should be guided by the GHG Protocol corporate standard. So there aren't typically categories of Scope 1 and 2 emissions that you would omit because they're not material. You'll want to complete a full Scope 1 and 2 inventory without any exclusions if possible. And keep in mind that even to exclude something, it has to be justified. So you'll have to at least screen it anyway. And if you already go through the effort of screening something, then you might as well just put it into the inventory. So if you're thinking, you know, our refrigerants are probably immaterial, you have to make sure that they're immaterial. So you'll end up with an emissions number. And I would say just include that in your inventory. Someone said they think they heard me, Brittany, thought she heard me say that GHG emissions reporting should encompass all entities of a company across the globe. That is correct. It should include all your entities in scope. So again, refer to the GHG protocol here. Depending on the consolidation approach that you select for your organization, you might have entities that are not within scope. But every entity in scope globally should be included. SB 261 explicitly asks for California-specific risks and opportunities, or is that an environment recommendation? That is an environment recommendation, but it's because we have seen all the legal interpretations that say it should be relevant to California. And that makes sense because it's a California state law. So it's really the California investors, the California consumers, and other California stakeholders that are interested in this information. So if your report isn't relevant to them, then it's not considered decision useful to those particular stakeholders. Another question, I thought part of the TCFD disclosures were reporting emissions. If that's the case, does that mean emissions must be disclosed to meet the requirements of SB 261? So yes, your emissions along with your target and other climate data should be included in your TCFD report, which is the framework that SB 261 uses or references in the regulation. Keep in mind that some companies are not subject to both regulations. So there are companies that meet that 500,000 revenue threshold that only have to do SB 261. So they would not separately submit an emissions inventory, but they should still have emissions to report under SB 261. And of course, if you're subject to both, you would use the same emissions information in both for both rules. But again, keep in mind that 261 is not an assured regulation or an assured report, but the emissions inventory under 251 does have to be assured. And then we have, when is assurance due for full year or fiscal year 2025 data for SB 253? And I think that's a good question for you, Brian. I think probably a lot of people have that question of, you know, we usually don't have our year-end data done by January 1st, and now we also have to fit in assurance. So how is that technically feasible?
Yeah, so I will share, and Constance, you mentioned the timing earlier. In the latest FAQs, this is really happening in real time here. The latest FAQs do state that the reporting on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions in 2026 will be on a date to be set by CARB through the regulatory process. So that guidance is still forthcoming. We are expecting it to be early in the year. You know, typically we do see assurance processes sometimes taking 4 weeks to go through, depending on timing and the availability of the information. So we'll be keeping this group informed, you know, as new information comes available. But that is on a date to be set.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out, Brian. I know I said January 1 because that is the latest that we knew of. But even for our client engagements, we set the time well into January because we don't expect the process to be complete by December 31st. Another question here is there a specific approach to the GHG protocol, equity versus control, that is prescribed for SB 261? There is not. You have to select the consolidation approach that makes the most sense for your own emissions inventory. And for that, obviously refer to the boundary chapter in the GHG protocol. Another question is, where can information be found to confirm compliance requirements for complex structured organizations? So the rules do not get into that much detail on organizational structure. Again, you'll have to reference both the GHG protocol and the TCFD framework. When you have different entities, different LLCs, different subsidiaries, partners. Again, if you're in a joint venture type structure, it will impact how you allocate your emissions as part of your emissions inventory. And it probably means that you have more to discuss in terms of climate-related risks for those entities, and you'll just have more work to do in determining those risks in the first place. So for that, I would just say make sure that you get started as soon as possible. And with that, we're at the top of the hour. Great questions. I want to thank our presenters and all of you for being here today, and hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Hey, Constance, before we jump, we have one more from Brittany here. She goes, how likely are they to implement the current proposal for the definition of doing business in California? Any signals on this definition?
Yeah, we think it'll be pretty similar to the existing franchise tax board definition. But either way, for now, that is what we have to assume. So don't hold off to prepare, waiting for the definitions to be finalized. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.